The lawyer's words hit me like a freight train. Your biological parents are suing you for $5.5 million. I stared at the legal documents, my hands trembling. The same people who abandoned 5-year-old me at LaGuardia Airport 23 years ago, leaving me with nothing but a torn teddy bear and a note saying they could not afford to keep me, were now claiming they deserved half of everything my adoptive father had left me in his will. But before I dive into this insane story, I need to know where you are watching from. Drop your location in the comments below and smash that like button, because this family betrayal story is about to get absolutely wild. Hit subscribe if you love Justice Served stories, and buckle up, because what my biological family did next will blow your mind. My name is Nova Sterling, and until 3 months ago, I thought I had finally found peace after years of therapy and building my own successful marketing agency in Manhattan. My adoptive father, Robert Sterling, had been my hero. He found me that terrible December night at the airport, a scared little girl clutching a stuffed elephant, and gave me a life filled with love, education, and opportunities I never could have imagined. When Dad passed away from cancer last year, I inherited his successful restaurant chain Sterling Eats, along with his personal savings and real estate investments totaling $5.5 million. I had been using that money to expand my business and donate to organizations that help abandoned children, something Dad would have loved. Then came the lawsuit. Margaret and David Thompson, my biological parents, had somehow tracked me down through public records after Dad's death made local news. Their lawyer claimed they had never abandoned me, that it was a misunderstanding, and that as my biological parents, they deserved half of my inheritance under some obscure family law statute they had dug up. I was furious but curious. How had they found me? Why now I hired a private investigator? Marcus Webb, a former police detective Dad had once helped when his own restaurant was failing. Marcus specialized in family fraud cases, and something about my parents' sudden appearance felt wrong. What Marcus discovered over the next 2 weeks shattered everything I thought I knew about my abandonment. The investigation revealed that Margaret and David Thompson had not been struggling young parents who could not afford a child. They had been running a sophisticated adoption fraud scheme in the early 2000s. Here is how their sick operation worked. They would identify wealthy couples desperate to adopt. Then Margaret would get pregnant and carry the child to term. Instead of going through legitimate adoption agencies where they would be screened and regulated, they would arrange private adoptions for enormous sums of money, sometimes up to $50,000 per child. But here was the truly evil part: they never legally signed away their parental rights. They would take the money, hand over the baby, then disappear. Years later, when they needed money, they would track down their biological children and either blackmail the adoptive families, or in cases like mine where the adoptive parents had passed away, sue for inheritance rights. Marcus found records showing they had done this to at least 12 other families over a 15-year period. Court documents revealed they had successfully extorted over $300,000 from families who paid them off, rather than fight lengthy legal battles. My case was different because I was not a planned adoption. Marcus discovered the real truth about that night at LaGuardia Airport through old security footage and police reports that had been buried in the system. The Thompson family had been living under assumed names in New York, running their adoption scam. But their operation was about to be exposed by an investigative journalist. In their panic to disappear, they decided I was excess baggage they could not afford to take with them as they fled to establish new identities in another state. The note they left with me was not a heartbreaking confession of poverty. It was a calculated move to make me appear to be a legitimate abandonment case rather than a kidnapping victim, which would have triggered a massive law enforcement response that could have interfered with their escape. Even more sickening, Marcus found evidence that they had been watching me from afar for years. They knew when I graduated high school, when I started my business, and when Dad got sick. They had been waiting for him to die so they could swoop in and claim what they saw as their payday. The private investigator also uncovered their current lifestyle. Margaret and David Thompson were living in a luxury home in Florida, driving expensive cars, and taking regular vacations to Europe. They were not struggling people who needed money. They were career criminals who saw me as just another mark in their long-running con game. But the most infuriating discovery was what they had done to other families. Marcus showed me court documents from a case in California where they had sued the adoptive parents of one of their biological sons when he inherited money from his grandfather. That family had been so traumatized by the legal battle that they had paid the Thompsons $75,000 just to make them go away. I realized that my biological parents were not just going after my inheritance. They were professional extortionists who had built their entire adult lives around exploiting the children they had sold and the families who had loved those children. The more I learned, the angrier I became. Not just for myself, but for all the families they had terrorized over the years. These people had turned child abandonment and adoption fraud into a business model, and they had been getting away with it for decades. I knew I could not just fight their lawsuit. I had to expose their entire operation and make sure they faced consequences for what they had done to so many families. But I also knew that taking on career criminals who had been successfully manipulating the legal system for years would require more than just anger and good intentions. I needed allies, I needed evidence, and I needed a strategy that would not just defeat their lawsuit, but destroy their ability to ever hurt another family again. Armed with Marcus's evidence, I decided to take the fight directly to the Thompsons. My lawyer, Sarah Kim, a brilliant family law attorney who specialized in adoption fraud cases, advised against confronting them directly. But I was done being reactive. These people had built their lives on exploiting children and terrorizing families, and I wanted them to know that their latest victim was not going to be another easy payday. I arranged to meet them at their lawyer's office in Florida under the pretense of discussing a settlement. What they did not know was that I had Marcus position himself in a nearby coffee shop with surveillance equipment, and Sarah had coordinated with a contact at the district attorney's office to have law enforcement ready to act on the evidence we were about to present. Walking into that conference room was one of the most surreal experiences of my life. Margaret Thompson, my biological mother, looked nothing like the struggling young woman I had imagined for years. She was immaculately dressed in designer clothes, her jewelry probably worth more than most people made in a year. David Thompson appeared equally well-maintained, wearing an expensive suit and a watch that Marcus had already identified as worth at least $15,000. They greeted me with fake warmth, playing the role of long-lost parents who had been searching for their beloved daughter for years. Margaret even tried to hug me, telling me how much I looked like her side of the family and how they had never stopped thinking about me. Their performance was Oscar-worthy, but I had come prepared with my own script. "I know what you are," I said, sliding a folder of evidence across the conference table. "I know about the adoption fraud scheme. I know about the other families you have extorted. I know that you did not abandon me because you were poor teenagers who could not afford a child. You dumped me at that airport because you were running from the law and I was inconvenient baggage." The transformation was immediate and chilling. The loving parent act disappeared, replaced by cold calculation. David leaned back in his chair and smiled in a way that made my skin crawl. "You cannot prove any of that," he said calmly. "We have lawyers who have been protecting our interests for a long time. Whatever you think you have found, we have been through this before. Families make accusations, they threaten to expose us, and then they realize how expensive and time-consuming it would be to actually fight us in court. They pay us to go away, and everyone moves on with their lives." Margaret nodded, pulling out a tablet and showing me photos of other families they had successfully extorted. "This is the Mitchell family from Oregon. They paid us $80,000 rather than let their adopted daughter go through the trauma of a custody battle. This is the Rodriguez family from Texas. $60,000 to keep their son from learning about his real origins. This is the Williams family from Colorado. $100,000 because they really did not want their church community to know about their infertility struggles." They were not just confessing to extortion, they were bragging about it. They genuinely believed they were untouchable, that their system was foolproof, and that I would eventually cave to their demands, just like every other family before me. That was when I played my first card. I pulled out my phone and showed them the recording app that had been running since I walked into the room. Everything they had just said was being broadcast live to Marcus in the coffee shop, who was recording it, and simultaneously streaming it to Sarah and her contact at the district attorney's office. The color drained from both their faces. Their lawyer, who had been quietly taking notes, suddenly looked very uncomfortable and started asking questions about what exactly his clients had just admitted to on a recorded call. But I was not finished. I had spent weeks preparing for this moment, and I wanted them to understand exactly how thoroughly their operation was about to be destroyed. I opened the folder and began laying out documents methodically. Bank records showing the payments they had received from families over the years. Court documents from cases they thought had been sealed or buried. Testimony from other families who had already agreed to speak to law enforcement. Evidence of their current lavish lifestyle, funded by extortion money. Most damaging of all, Marcus had tracked down the investigative journalist whose work had originally caused them to flee New York 23 years ago. She had never stopped investigating adoption fraud, and she had been building a case against the Thompsons for years, waiting for enough evidence to make charges stick. Jennifer Walsh from the Miami Herald is publishing her exposé tomorrow morning. I told them. She has been working on this story for 3 years, interviewing families, tracking financial records, and building a comprehensive case against your entire operation. Your names, your faces, your methods, and your victims are all going to be front-page news. Margaret tried to interrupt, claiming they could get an injunction to stop publication, but I held up my hand. She is not the only one. Marcus found 2 other journalists who have been independently investigating adoption fraud schemes. There is a documentary filmmaker who has been tracking your operation since the California case 3 years ago. A victim advocacy group has been building a class action lawsuit against you for 18 months. David was now visibly panicking, asking his lawyer what their options were, talking about fleeing to a country without extradition treaties. But their lawyer was already packing up his files, clearly realizing that representing clients who had just confessed to multiple felonies on a recorded call was not good for his career prospects. That was when I delivered the final blow. I pulled out a document that Marcus had helped me prepare, a comprehensive legal filing that would not just defend against their lawsuit, but launch criminal charges against them for adoption fraud, extortion, child endangerment, and racketeering. But this was not just about one family's revenge. I had spent the past month contacting every family the Thompsons had victimized, building a network of people who were ready to finally fight back together. The Rodriguez family from Texas, the Mitchell family from Oregon, the Williams family from Colorado. 8 other families who had been terrorized into silence for years. You have been successful because you picked your victims carefully, I told them. Families who could afford to pay you to go away, families who valued their privacy more than justice, families who did not want to traumatize their children with legal battles. But you made a mistake with me. I am not afraid of public scrutiny. I am not worried about my reputation. And I am definitely not going to pay you a single dollar to continue your criminal enterprise. As I stood up to leave, Margaret made one last desperate attempt to manipulate me. "You are our daughter," she said, tears streaming down her face. "We made mistakes when we were young, but we never stopped loving you. Do not destroy your own family over money." I turned back and looked at her with all the disgust I felt. "You are not my family. You are criminals who sold me like property and then abandoned me when I became inconvenient. My family was the man who found me at that airport and gave me a life filled with love and security. My family are the friends and colleagues who have supported me through building my business and dealing with his death. My family are the other children you victimized who are now brave enough to stand up and fight back against you." I walked out of that conference room knowing that I had just declared war on people who had been successfully destroying families for decades. But I also knew that I was not fighting alone anymore. The network of allies I had built was about to become the foundation for something much bigger than just defending against their lawsuit. The response to our coordinated attack was swift and more intense than I had anticipated. Within 48 hours of the recorded confrontation, three major news outlets had picked up Jennifer Walsh's story about the Thompson adoption fraud scheme. The Miami Herald's expose was shared thousands of times on social media, and suddenly my private family nightmare had become a national conversation about adoption fraud and victim rights. But the Thompsons were not going down without a fight. They hired a high-powered legal team specializing in crisis management and media manipulation. Their new strategy was to paint me as a vindictive adopted child who was making up stories to avoid sharing my inheritance with my biological parents. They leaked their own version of events to sympathetic media contacts, portraying themselves as struggling parents who had been forced to make an impossible choice decades ago and were now being persecuted by their own daughter. The public relations battle was vicious. Their lawyers found every mistake I had ever made, every business dispute I had been involved in, every moment of my life that could be twisted to make me appear unstable or greedy. They hired a private investigator to dig into my relationship with my adoptive father, looking for any evidence that might suggest I had manipulated him or unduly influenced his will. Most disturbing of all, they began targeting the other families in our alliance. The Rodriguez family received threatening letters suggesting that their adopted son might be taken away if they continued cooperating with law enforcement. The Mitchell family found their business reviews being bombed online by fake accounts. The Williams family discovered that someone had been asking questions about them in their neighborhood, making their neighbors suspicious about their family situation. It became clear that the Thompsons had connections and resources far beyond what we had initially understood. This was not just a two-person operation running small-scale adoption fraud. They were part of a larger network that included corrupt lawyers, complicit private investigators, and media contacts who could be bought to spread disinformation. That realization led to our first major breakthrough in understanding the true scope of their operation. Marcus, who had been expanding his investigation with the help of law enforcement contacts, discovered that the Thompsons were connected to at least three other couples running similar adoption fraud schemes across different states. The network operated like a franchise system. Each couple would establish their operation in a different region, sharing information about potential victims, legal strategies that worked, and media contacts who could be relied upon to spin stories in their favor. They had been operating for almost 30 years, and their victim count was in the hundreds. This discovery changed everything about our legal strategy. Sarah Kim realized that we were not just fighting a lawsuit, we were taking on organized crime. She brought in federal prosecutors who specialized in racketeering cases, and suddenly our alliance expanded to include FBI agents who had been tracking adoption fraud networks for years. The investigation revealed that the Thompsons and their network had been operating with near impunity because they were experts at exploiting the most vulnerable aspects of family law. Adoptive families were naturally protective of their children's privacy and emotionally invested in maintaining family stability. Biological children who had been adopted often struggled with identity issues that made them susceptible to manipulation. The legal system was slow and expensive, making it easier for most families to pay extortion demands rather than fight lengthy court battles. But their system had never been challenged by a coordinated group of victims working with experienced federal investigators and skilled media allies. Our alliance was growing stronger every day, and we were beginning to understand how to turn their own tactics against them. The breakthrough came when Marcus identified a former associate of the Thompsons who was willing to cooperate with federal investigators. Linda Morrison had been part of their network in the early 2000s, but had left the operation after a disagreement about targeting a family whose adopted child had special needs. Linda provided inside information about how the network operated, including details about their financial systems, their communication methods, and most importantly, their pressure tactics for intimidating families into paying extortion demands. She also revealed something that transformed our understanding of my own case. The Thompsons had not randomly chosen to target me after my adoptive father's death. They had been monitoring his health for over 2 years, waiting for him to die so they could launch their lawsuit. They had even attempted to make contact with him while he was undergoing cancer treatment, hoping to manipulate him into changing his will to include provisions for them. When Dad had refused to meet with them and had instead strengthened his will to ensure I would be protected from exactly this kind of manipulation, they had decided to wait for his death and pursue their claim through the courts. This revelation was infuriating, but it also provided us with powerful evidence for our criminal case. The Thompsons had been stalking a cancer patient and planning to exploit his death for financial gain. Their lawsuit was not a legitimate family law dispute. It was the culmination of a years-long criminal conspiracy. Armed with Linda's testimony and the federal investigation findings, our legal team prepared a comprehensive counterattack. We were no longer just defending against their lawsuit, we were launching a federal criminal case against their entire network. The alliance of families had grown to include over 20 families from across the country, and we had attracted the attention of several high-profile victim advocacy organizations. The case was becoming a symbol of fighting back against family-based extortion schemes, and media attention was intensifying. But just as we were gaining momentum, I received a phone call that would test everything we had built. It was from Rebecca Martinez, one of the families in our alliance, and she sounded terrified. "Nova, we need to talk," she said, her voice shaking. "Something has happened. I think someone in our group has been feeding information to the Thompsons. They know things about our legal strategy that only someone on our side could have told them." The possibility of betrayal within our alliance was devastating. We had built our entire strategy on trust and shared information, and if someone was working with the Thompsons, everything we had worked for could be compromised. As I prepared to investigate this potential betrayal, I realized that the stakes of our fight had escalated far beyond my personal lawsuit. We were now fighting for the future of dozens of families, the integrity of adoption law, and the principle that victims of long-term criminal schemes could band together to demand justice. But first we had to identify the traitor in our midst before they could destroy everything we had built. The investigation into our alliance's security breach led to a discovery that shattered my faith in people I had come to trust completely. Rebecca Martinez's suspicions were correct, but the identity of the traitor was far worse than anyone had imagined. It was Linda Morrison, the former network associate, who had provided us with inside information about the Thompson operation. The woman I had celebrated as our most valuable ally, the person whose testimony was the cornerstone of our federal criminal case, had been playing both sides from the beginning. Marcus uncovered the truth through financial records that showed Linda had been receiving payments from a shell company controlled by the Thompsons throughout the entire period she had been cooperating with our investigation. She had not left their network years ago due to moral objections. She had been positioned as a long-term sleeper agent, waiting for exactly this kind of situation where law enforcement or victims might threaten their operation. The betrayal was sophisticated and devastating. Linda had fed the Thompsons detailed information about our legal strategy, our evidence, our timeline for criminal charges, and most damaging of all, personal information about the families in our alliance that could be used to intimidate them. Every family meeting Linda had attended, every strategy session she had participated in, every piece of evidence she had reviewed, had been reported back to the people we were fighting. The Thompsons had been staying one step ahead of us because they knew exactly what we were planning before we executed it. The revelation explained why their counterattacks had been so precisely targeted. They knew which families were most vulnerable to pressure, which legal arguments would be most effective against our case, and which media narratives would be most damaging to our credibility. But the betrayal went deeper than just information sharing. Linda had been actively sabotaging our efforts from within. She had convinced 3 families to drop out of our alliance by feeding them false information about the risks they were taking. She had delayed crucial evidence gathering by misdirecting Marcus's investigation toward dead ends. She had even attempted to turn families against each other by spreading rumors about who was really committed to the fight and who might be considering settling privately. The most devastating aspect of Linda's betrayal was psychological. I had trusted her completely, sharing personal details about my abandonment trauma and my relationship with my adoptive father. She had positioned herself as a mentor figure, someone who understood the criminal network better than anyone, and could guide us through the complexities of taking them down. Learning that every moment of vulnerability I had shared with her had been weaponized against me was more painful than the original abandonment by my biological parents. At least with them, I had known they were enemies. Linda had made me believe she was family. The immediate consequences of the betrayal were catastrophic. The Thompsons' legal team filed motions to dismiss all criminal charges based on their advanced knowledge of our evidence. They argued that our investigation had been compromised by unreliable sources and tainted testimony. Several families in our alliance received new threats that were so specifically targeted to their vulnerabilities that they immediately withdrew from the case. Most critically, Linda's betrayal had compromised our federal investigation. The FBI agents working on the case had to assume that the entire Thompson network now knew the scope of law enforcement's involvement, the evidence that had been gathered, and the timeline for arrests. Sarah Kim called an emergency meeting with the remaining families in our alliance. The mood was defeated and paranoid. People who had been working together for months now looked at each other with suspicion, wondering if there might be other traitors among us. "We have to face the reality," Sarah told us grimly. "Everything we have built over the past 4 months has been compromised. The Thompsons know our strategy, they have turned our key witness, and they have successfully intimidated half of our families into abandoning the fight. From a legal standpoint, we are back to where we started, except now they know we are coming, and they have had time to prepare their defenses." The federal prosecutors were even more direct. They explained that Linda's betrayal had not just damaged our civil case, it had potentially destroyed any chance of successful criminal prosecution. Defense attorneys would argue that the entire investigation had been compromised by an unreliable informant, and judges would be sympathetic to those arguments. For the first time since this fight began, I seriously considered giving up. The Thompsons had proven that they were more sophisticated, more ruthless, and more connected than we had understood. They had infiltrated our inner circle, manipulated our most trusted ally, and destroyed months of careful preparation. But as I sat in that conference room surrounded by the remaining families who had not yet been intimidated into withdrawal, I realized something important. The Thompsons' greatest strength was also their greatest weakness. They were so confident in their ability to manipulate and control people that they had become careless about covering their tracks. Linda's betrayal had been extensive and well documented. Marcus had recorded many of their strategy sessions. Sarah had email chains detailing Linda's contributions to our legal planning, and the FBI had surveillance footage of Linda's meetings with our alliance. If we could prove that Linda had been working for the Thompsons while pretending to cooperate with law enforcement, we would not just expose one traitor. We would demonstrate that the Thompson network was sophisticated enough to plant long-term agents within victim advocacy groups, which was evidence of an even more serious criminal enterprise than we had originally understood. The betrayal that was meant to destroy us could become the key to bringing down their entire operation, but only if we were smart enough and strong enough to turn the tables one final time. As I looked around that conference room at the families who had refused to be intimidated, I realized we were about to enter the most dangerous phase of our fight. The Thompsons now knew we were wounded but not defeated, and they would do everything in their power to finish us off before we could recover. Just when our situation seemed hopeless, an unexpected ally emerged who would transform our entire fight against the Thompson network. Dr. Amanda Pierce, a forensic psychologist who specialized in family trauma and criminal manipulation, reached out to Sarah Kim after reading about our case in the Miami Herald. Dr. Pierce had been quietly building her own investigation into adoption fraud schemes for over 5 years as part of her academic research, but her interest was deeply personal. Her younger brother had been victimized by an operation similar to the Thompsons' network 15 years earlier, and she had watched her family struggle with the psychological aftermath of being systematically manipulated and extorted. What made Dr. Pierce invaluable was not just her professional expertise, but the evidence she had been gathering independently. Her research had uncovered connections between the Thompson network and similar operations across 12 different states, creating a comprehensive picture of how these criminal enterprises functioned at a national level. Most importantly, Dr. Pierce had been investigating Linda Morrison for 2 years before she ever made contact with our alliance. Her research into manipulation tactics used by criminal networks had identified Linda as a likely operative based on her pattern of appearing in multiple fraud cases as a supposedly reformed insider who provided just enough legitimate information to gain trust while systematically sabotaging investigations from within. Dr. Pierce had documentation proving that Linda had played similar roles in at least 4 other cases where families had attempted to fight back against adoption fraud schemes. In each case, Linda had gained access to victim alliances, gathered intelligence about their strategies, and ultimately contributed to their defeat through carefully orchestrated betrayals. But Dr. Pierce had something even more valuable. She had been working with a federal task force that specialized in long-term criminal conspiracies involving family law. This task force had been investigating adoption fraud networks for over 7 years, building cases slowly and methodically to avoid exactly the kind of compromised investigations that had destroyed previous efforts to prosecute these criminals. The task force had been aware of our alliance from the beginning, but they had deliberately avoided making contact because they suspected there might be infiltrators within our group. Linda Morrison's betrayal had actually confirmed their suspicions and provided them with the final pieces of evidence they needed to move forward with a comprehensive prosecution. Dr. Pierce explained that our fight against the Thompsons had never been just about one family's lawsuit. We had unknowingly become part of a much larger federal investigation into organized crime networks that exploited family law vulnerabilities. Our alliance had served as a valuable intelligence gathering operation, even though Linda's betrayal had compromised our immediate goals. The evidence that Dr. Pierce and the federal task force had been gathering was staggering. Financial records showed that the Thompson network had generated over $4.2 million in extortion payments over the past 15 years. Communication intercepts revealed coordination between criminal groups in different states sharing victim information and successful manipulation tactics. Most damaging of all, they had recorded conversations between network leaders discussing specific families they planned to target, including detailed discussions about my adoptive father's illness and their timeline for pursuing his estate after his death. Dr. Pierce's alliance with our group created an entirely new dynamic in our fight against the Thompsons. Instead of being reactive victims trying to defend ourselves against their attacks, we became active participants in a sophisticated law enforcement operation designed to dismantle their entire criminal enterprise. The federal task force had been waiting for the right moment to make arrests, and Linda's betrayal had actually provided them with the perfect opportunity. By documenting her role as a double agent, they could demonstrate the criminal sophistication of the Thompson network while simultaneously discrediting any defense arguments based on compromised investigations. Working with Dr. Pierce and the federal task force, we rebuilt our legal strategy around a much more comprehensive understanding of what we were fighting. This was not just about my inheritance or even the dozen families in our original alliance. This was about exposing a criminal network that had been systematically exploiting adoption law for decades. The new evidence was overwhelming. Financial records that Linda had been unable to compromise because she had never known about the federal investigation. Communication intercepts that revealed the true scope of the network's operations. Testimony from other law enforcement agencies that had been building parallel cases against different aspects of the criminal enterprise. Most satisfying of all, Dr. Pierce had evidence proving that Linda Morrison's betrayal was itself a federal crime. Her role as a paid infiltrator, working to obstruct justice and intimidate witnesses, made her a co-conspirator in the very criminal enterprise she was supposed to be helping us fight. The Thompsons' confidence in their ability to manipulate our investigation had led them to be careless about their communications with Linda. The federal task force had been monitoring those communications for months, gathering evidence about their criminal methods while allowing them to believe they were successfully compromising our efforts. As we prepared for the final phase of our fight, I realized that everything the Thompsons had done to try to destroy us had actually contributed to building the case that would bring them down. Their harassment of Alliance families had created additional criminal charges. Their media manipulation campaign had generated public attention that made their eventual prosecution more visible. Their infiltration of our group through Linda had demonstrated the sophisticated criminal nature of their enterprise. Dr. Pierce helped me understand that surviving their attacks and refusing to give up had accomplished something far more significant than just defending my inheritance. Our alliance had become the catalyst for exposing a criminal network that might have continued operating for years if we had not been brave enough to fight back publicly. The federal task force was ready to move forward with arrests, armed with evidence that had been gathering for years and strengthened by everything the Thompsons had done to try to stop us. But first, they wanted to give the Thompson network one final opportunity to incriminate themselves by responding to what they believed was our weakened and compromised alliance. The trap was set, and after months of being on the defensive, we were finally ready to go on the offensive in a way that would end their criminal enterprise forever. The final confrontation came exactly 6 months after the Thompsons had first sued me for my inheritance. Federal agents coordinated simultaneous arrests across 4 states, taking down not just Margaret and David Thompson, but the entire criminal network they had been operating with for nearly 3 decades. The morning of the arrests, I was invited to observe from the Federal Task Force Command Center as they executed search warrants at properties connected to the network. Watching Margaret and David Thompson being led away in handcuffs from their luxury Florida home was surreal, but what struck me most was how ordinary they looked when stripped of their manipulative charm and expensive clothes. The evidence seized during the raids exceeded even Dr. Pierce's expectations. The Thompsons had kept detailed records of every family they had targeted, every extortion payment they had received, and every manipulation tactic they had used. Their documentation of their crimes was so comprehensive that federal prosecutors described it as the most complete evidence package they had ever seen in a racketeering case. Linda Morrison's arrest was particularly satisfying because it demonstrated how thoroughly her betrayal had backfired. Instead of destroying our case, her role as a double agent had provided federal investigators with direct evidence of the criminal network's sophisticated methods for intimidating victims and obstructing justice. The criminal charges were extensive. The Thompson network faced federal racketeering charges, mail fraud, wire fraud, extortion, conspiracy, and in several cases involving younger children charges related to child endangerment. The prosecution estimated that their crimes had affected over 200 families across 15 states over a 30-year period. But the legal victory was only part of what made this fight worthwhile. The alliance of families that had formed to resist the Thompson network had evolved into something much more significant than a group of victims seeking justice. Working with Dr. Pierce and several victim advocacy organizations, we established the Sterling Foundation for Family Justice, named in honor of my adoptive father. The foundation provides legal support, counseling services, and investigation resources for families dealing with adoption fraud and family-based extortion schemes. The foundation also works with lawmakers to strengthen adoption law and close the legal loopholes that criminal networks like the Thompsons had exploited for decades. Our experience fighting back against sophisticated criminals has informed policy changes in multiple states, making it much harder for future criminal enterprises to operate with impunity. Most personally meaningful to me, the foundation has helped connect dozens of families who survived similar attacks, creating a support network that goes far beyond legal assistance. The relationships I built during our fight against the Thompsons have become some of the most important friendships of my life. Rebecca Martinez, whose suspicions about Linda Morrison had helped uncover the betrayal, became the Foundation's first program director. Marcus Webb left his private investigation practice to work full-time on cases involving family-based criminal networks. Sarah Kim established a legal clinic specifically focused on helping families fight back against extortion schemes. The financial resolution of my case was almost anticlimactic compared to the criminal prosecution. With the Thompsons facing decades in federal prison and their criminal operation completely exposed, their lawsuit against my inheritance was dismissed with prejudice. The court also ordered them to pay restitution to all their victims, though most of their assets were seized as part of the criminal case. I used a significant portion of my inheritance to fund the Sterling Foundation, knowing that Dad would have approved of using his legacy to protect other families from the kind of criminals who had tried to exploit his death. The trial itself became a media sensation, with journalists and documentary filmmakers following every development. The story of how a group of victim families had banded together to expose a nationwide criminal network resonated with people across the country who had their own experiences with family manipulation and exploitation. But what surprised me most about the aftermath was how much I had grown personally through the experience of fighting back. When the Thompsons first sued me, I was an angry and isolated person dealing with grief over my father's death, while trying to understand my own complicated feelings about abandonment and family loyalty. Fighting their criminal network had forced me to confront those issues directly, while also connecting with other people who had survived similar trauma. The alliance we built was not just about legal strategy, it became a chosen family of people who understood what it meant to be targeted by criminal manipulation and who refused to let those experiences define them as victims. Dr. Pierce helped me understand that choosing to fight back even when the odds seemed impossible had been an act of healing as much as an act of justice. Instead of allowing the Thompsons to continue benefiting from the harm they had caused me, I had transformed that harm into a force for protecting other families. The foundation continues to grow, and we regularly receive contacts from families dealing with similar situations. Each case is different, but the pattern is often the same: criminal networks that exploit family relationships, legal systems that are slow to respond to sophisticated manipulation, and victims who feel isolated and powerless until they realize they are not alone. 5 years later, I can honestly say that being sued by my biological parents was one of the best things that ever happened to me, not because the experience was pleasant, but because it forced me to discover strength I did not know I had, and connected me with people who became my true family. The Thompsons are now serving federal prison sentences ranging from 12 to 25 years. Linda Morrison received 15 years for her role as a criminal infiltrator. The other members of their network received sentences proportional to their involvement in the criminal enterprise. But more importantly, their victims have found justice healing. And in many cases, the kind of chosen family relationships that criminal networks try to destroy. That transformation from victim to survivor to advocate is the real victory in this story. Have you ever had to fight back against someone who underestimated your strength? Have you experienced the power of building alliances with people who truly understand your struggles? I would love to hear your stories about standing up to family manipulation or finding justice after betrayal. Drop your experiences in the comments below and let me know if this story inspired you to take action in your own life. If this cold revenge story showed you the importance of never giving up when fighting for what is right, please hit that like button and share this video with anyone who needs to hear about the power of chosen family over biological manipulation. Subscribe for more stories about justice served and karma delivered, and remember that sometimes the family that abandons you does you the biggest favor of your life by forcing you to find the people who will truly stand by you when it matters most. Thank you for watching my journey from abandoned child to advocate for family justice. And I hope my story reminds you that no criminal network is too sophisticated and no betrayal is too deep to overcome when you refuse to fight alone.